Hi everyone, today I'm talking about Mary Casey's poem The Class Game, and I'm specifically going to focus on its voice, how the speaker uses poetic voice to make comments about working class authenticity as a theme. Now, it's likely when you're analysing this poem that you're going to be asked to comment on context, and that's a little bit of a difficult brief in this case because Mary Casey was in no sense a member of the literary establishment. She was a working class housewife from Liverpool. She wasn't in any sense a major known writer. She wasn't part of any kind of literary canon. That makes it difficult to comment on the history of this and her biography. But in some respects, that's the point. Voices, which is the magazine that published the poem in 1979, specifically sought out writers from marginalised background. It went looking for people who were not part of the literary establishment with the intention of granting a voice to writers from communities whose voices are not often heard in literature. That is the perspective you need to keep in mind when you're analysing this poem. So, since this is a poem about class, and since its title is The Class Game, it might be worthwhile to linger on the title a little bit longer and analyse it more closely. In my view, the connotations of the word game really split off in two different directions. On the one hand, you can think of a game as something that's meant to be fun. It's something that you play recreationally. You do it for enjoyment. It's not meant to be terribly serious. But on the other hand, there are some associations of the term that, in the right context, could take on a more serious dimension. We might think of it as being something competitive, something difficult, and something that implicitly has a winner and a loser, which in the context of class interactions might not be frivolous at all. What we see in the poem is that Mary Casey plays with both ideas, sometimes at the same time, resulting in a piece that can appear to be very playful and humorous, but at the same time hides a more serious challenge to the reader within it. So we've established that there's a kind of duality being presented in the central theme of this poem. So now I think it's productive to look a little more at the perspective of the speaker. Now, it's important to remember that the speaker of the poem, the voice in the text, is not strictly speaking Mary Casey herself. Whether or not it adopts any of her own genuine perspectives and positions, I have no idea. Not for me to speculate about that, or for you. So keep in mind that the speaker and the poet are two distinct entities. In this case, because the poem uses so much direct address, and because it asks so many questions, we need to consider that implicitly this poem has a listener, that there exists a perspective within the poem that this voice is directed at. Whether that's an individual, whether that's a collective, doesn't really matter. But the point is this poem is directed at a particular kind of audience, and that audience is of a different class to the speaker. By using this framing, Casey is really able to set the purpose of the poem. Rather than commenting on class issues in a neutral way, she's able to present them as a direct challenge, to force the listener to acknowledge her class, and to force them to question and challenge their own prejudices that maybe they hold unthinkingly. This is where the fact that the poem was published in a magazine that was specifically looking to publish working class and non-professional writers becomes extremely important. If literature and the literary canon is excessively dominated by a certain specific class of writer, then characters and voices from other classes are only ever going to get represented at one remove. Those stories are not going to be told from the perspective of people living those lives. And that raises the possibility that all kinds of inaccuracies and prejudices are going to then bleed into these texts. The purpose of this poem is to, in a sense, fight back against that kind of thing and make sure that a working class perspective is told with a working class voice. That it has a kind of authenticity that it might not otherwise have in a more mainstream publication. Now, a great focus of the poem's content deals with stereotypes, and Casey does not limit herself merely to working class stereotypes. One of the interesting things about the poem is that it plays working class and middle class stereotypes off against one another, and I've put two examples side by side on the screen here. She starts off dealing rather sarcastically with some particularly unflattering stereotypes of the working classes, namely that they are unemployed and implicitly work-shy. And in many ways that explains the presence of all these questions. How can you tell what class I'm from? She is challenging the listener and the reader to come up with a good reason to make an inference about what class she's from that goes beyond stereotypes. Hence, the sarcasm again at the bottom of the screen there, have I a label on me head and another on me bum? She is suggesting in so many words that the reasons people use to make judgments about class are not in themselves very compelling. But on the other hand, she takes middle-class stereotypes and subverts them. Her picture of a middle-class character is hardly flattering, with its lily-white hands, never known a hard day's work in its life, and wince when they hear some fairly mild vulgarities. She's certainly not holding a middle-class stereotype up as an ideal. Instead, she uses the poem to celebrate her own status, her own working-class identity, at a time in the late 70s where things like regional English accents were still quite rare on television and in the media generally. This mention of regional dialects brings me to one of the most important aspects of the poem's content, which is its analysis of vocabulary. Casey spends quite a lot of time in the poem contrasting different terminology for various everyday ideas, like patio and yard, toilet and bog, bread pudding and wet Nelly. By doing so, she is pointing out that her vocabulary is part of what marks her out as being of a different class to the implied listener. This is in contrast with Standard English, which is more associated with London and the South East, and more specifically the middle-class cultural and economic centre of the UK. Now, there's certainly nothing wrong with Standard English. I'm speaking Standard English now. But the concept of it as Standard English does implicitly cast a judgment on users of dialects. Today, where we hear a great range of diverse voices and accents and dialects all over the media, this point may be somewhat lost on a modern reader of this poem. But you really must appreciate in 1979 how dominant Standard English was in film, TV, radio, and the media generally. It would have been very, very unusual to have heard this kind of voice in any other context than a stereotype or a cartoon. The idea that a broad and diverse range of accents and dialects should be accepted by the literary establishment is really quite a recent phenomenon. What Mary Casey's speaker is dealing with is the accusation that she is somehow using language wrong. We get that idea from the image of her listener wincing when she uses, as it would be, improper vocabulary. But Casey rejects this idea, and the poem builds to this big finale where she defiantly asserts her dialect and her vocabulary as authentic, and rejects the idea that by deviating from Standard English she is using language with any less skill. It's probably worth zooming out a bit at this point and thinking about poetry in general as a concept. Poetry is arguably the oldest form of literature, by which I mean writing presented for its literary merit as opposed to pure utility. It has for thousands of years been considered the highest form of art. Going back in just British history, for many centuries, quality of poetry was defined by technical complexity. The more technical the poem, the more skillful the poet. the idea that poetry could be a medium for anyone to use and appreciate, and that it doesn't require a strict metre or a strict rhyme scheme, is, again, quite a recent idea. It's really a 20th century invention. When T.S. Eliot published The Love Song of J. Alfred Prufrock in 1915, it broke with a lot of poetic conventions from the Victorian era, and it caused a huge amount of controversy for what nowadays looks very ordinary. But Casey doesn't go quite that far. This poem is not free verse. It does have a clear metre. It does have a clear rhyme scheme. That, in a sense, becomes part of its playfulness. She takes her authentic, challenging, working-class vocabulary and associates it with poetic techniques that come from the literary establishment. She is able to blend two forms of language use. So that line from near the beginning of the poem, "I can talk posh like some," becomes much more significant than it perhaps looks at first reading. Casey and her speaker are more than capable of adopting the language structures of the middle-class establishment. Therefore, the fact that language is used to cast aspersions and make judgments about people only looks more artificial and unfair. So, just to sum up, Casey really makes use of stereotypes. The poem is riddled with them, one after the other, and she uses them in two main ways. Firstly, she celebrates stereotypes associated with the working class. She takes images and ideas and phrasings and vocabulary that's often used in a very critical sense and celebrates it. Likewise, she takes middle-class figures and presents them very unflatteringly, as being effete and cowardly and weak. Now, she uses what would be termed an informal dialect. She uses dialect spellings throughout. This forces us as a reader to acknowledge her regional identity, to read the poem in her accent, and this is specifically done in a publication that is designed to allow people to offer a sense of their own identity for themselves, as opposed to having their perspectives told by others on their behalf. But the cleverest part of the poem for me is that it blends variant dialect with traditional poetic techniques. And that means that contrasts like formal and informal, or standard and non-standard, are shown to be much less solid than people like to think. You've got to remember that members of privileged classes are motivated to try to reinforce that privilege. And one of the ways of doing that is to police the clear boundaries between formal and informal, standard and non-standard. So the best way for Casey to challenge that, as she does, is rather to attack one outright, adopt parts of it and make use of them in combination with her own voice.